Okay. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Just a few reminders I told you about. You probably heard 1,000 times about the mic, if you could mute it, but feel free to ask questions. Um, you can also, if you don't feel like speaking, you can also hit the chat button at the bottom of the screen on computers, and you can type in a question and we'll find the questions. Or just raise your hand. We'll find a way to discuss things. Um, I think that's all for housekeeping. Just to introduce Kyle, Kyle Marshall is a designer based in New York City and Locust Valley, where he maintains an early 19th century homestead. He's creative director for Bunny Williams Home and was formerly a furniture designer for Ralph Lauren Home. He graduated with a degree in architecture from the Rhode Island School of Design, and he's here to talk about his book, Americana, which he wrote and photographed. And which is, it's a long time to just, you can really indulge in reading it, and there's so much historical detail and beautiful photography. I'm really looking forward to this. So I think that's everything, and I'll hand it over to Kyle.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for coming. Let me start this. Okay, hold on, I have to move my little, we'll leave it there. So the Long Island farmhouse. I think houses are such a deeply romantic thing because they're sort of like novels with many layers, and some are really overt and they just kind of pop into your face, and others are really subtle, and it takes a long time until you start noticing patterns. I'm just talking about the building envelope. But what makes the house come alive is the sense of people coming and going, that there's been a history of whether it's been 50 years, 150 years, 250 years, or 350 years. And having grown up in the North Shore, I was always sort of aware of these houses. But to me, they were just these beautiful places that I really loved looking at. And I didn't think anything more than that. That's what an old house is. Eventually, I find myself in architecture school, and I realized, as I'm looking through all the books I have access to at RISD, that there was no book on the Long Island farmhouse as I understood it. The earliest or the best book before this one is probably about 100 years old. And the problem with that was I suspected that it was the 20th century and the 21st that was what my interest was. And so I thought, well, maybe I could try to take a stab at it, knowing that there had been some really great literature by people like Barbara Van Loo, who was a great historian on the island, who worked throughout the 20th century and had a great sense of humor in her writing, amongst several other notable local people who really kind of took a stab at the subject. But what motivates me is the visual. And so this is kind of the mood board. If you were to ask me, what is a Long Island farmhouse? This is what it is. And we could just leave it at this, because I think it's the visual, it's the superficial that leads you to deeper understandings if you let yourself kind of be enveloped by the subject. You'll see bits of landscape, bits of wallpaper, bits of ceramic and pottery, bits of garden in different states and different seasons, houses prepared for different states and different seasons. Some of these houses are privately owned and still lived in by the same family for quite some time. Others have changed hands multiple times. Some are held in trust for the community, but all of them feel very alive. And to me, it was very important to focus on houses that were extant, that were still around, because as someone who loves old houses and loves books, I don't like nostalgia, and I don't like the sense of it was better then, especially when I know how alive the subject was. So I spent a few years just reaching out to people and saying, hey, I have this idea for a book, could I come visit you? If I don't know you, and oftentimes I didn't know them, so I wrote them a letter. And one person who called me back was Eleanor Williams, and she said, sure, come out, come visit the house. And it was a sweltering summer day. I was sweating like I am now, with, in no AC in the car. And I get there, and there's this very inviting, deep porch. And I walk up to it, I knock on the door, and I'm let in, and I meet her, and she's about 98 when we met. And, it was just sweltering, and now we're having black coffee, and she's extremely charming. And she kind of gives me the rundown of her life as we're chatting. and speaks about, living in China under Mao as a newlywed, and, interesting, like a line from the novel, like left China to come to Orient and to find her past, and wound up buying a house she was familiar with as a young girl, having grown up on the North Fork, because it was formerly owned by a forebear of hers. So the entire time we're speaking, she's just totally charming. She's one of those magnetic personalities that just kind of, you just feel kind of united with her in the moment as she's telling you these things. And there's this door next to her, and it's all these diamond panes, and it's very funny. It looks repurposed, somewhat out of place in this very calm, sedate cream room that we were in. And at the end of our conversation, she says, well, I guess you'd like to see the house. And so she gets up onto her walker and flings open the door, and there's a cavity about maybe 10 inches deep of shelf, and another door, and she flings it open, and it's like looking through a looking glass, like Alice in Wonderland. It's her private museum that she also sort of lives in, filled with all the furniture that she and her husband had collected from the area, most Long Island made, or had at least lived for a time in Long Island houses. And I was just totally charmed, and her sense of color, and her sense of place and occasion, and her kind of free-spirited nature and interest in learning. University students have been coming and going for decades, excavating on the property to learn more about the sense of place. And so when I took that shot, I kind of suspected it would be the cover. And the strange thing in a way was because it's the 17th and 18th century looking towards, the 19th, but you don't get to the 20th century still, but it's getting there. And the 20th century for me is really what the Long Island Farmhouse, when it really came into its own as a style. And so when I say Long Island Farmhouse, what I'm trying to get at is it does many things. It's both a style and a sensibility. It's a vernacular, it's a building practice, and it's a physical thing. It's a collection of physical things that envelops multiple histories. And so the guiding thing, since I'm a very visual person, it's about the sense of atmosphere, and how there are truths and half-truths and lies, but everything kind of unites into this sort of living, breathing thing. And I guess a uniting line across all these houses was there's a sense of evolutionary growth. And so just talking and focusing on sensibility, this is a way that these houses were propagated in the media, in publications in the 20th century. This sort of very inviting arbor, right? It's in vogue. It's a vernacular. It's now kind of, because of its proximity to New York, publications like Vogue or architectural magazines and pamphlets would send photographers or illustrators out to a place that was local, and for New York City, it's Long Island, to record and to sort of express, this desire for a rural simplicity sometimes, other times a rural sophistication, other times just something that wasn't the city. Here's Toni Frizzell, who's decked up as a society woman in a beautiful house, but she was also a war photographer and known for athletic portraiture. And she had a great house, Sherwog, out in St. James. Here's later on Jeffrey Bill Huber's house in Locust Valley Hay Fever recorded, and he did a great job fixing it up. Here's Anna Wintour's house, or one of her houses, with the garden by Miranda Brooks. And there's a sense of place in all of this. And so back to Toni, I was always thinking about how she portrayed people. She didn't really let go of the awkwardness of people. Sometimes it can be sort of majestic in a way if you're able to capture somebody in a strange moment. She was really great with all sorts of people, and she would stage people, and sometimes it would be staged at her house. This is portraits of her. She's out in Rome on the left. On the right, she's going to take the coronation portraits of the Churchill family. On the left is actually at another Long Island house, kind of a Gold Coast period property, the Moat at Chelsea, which is a whole other building tradition, but also embedded in a romantic sensibility. The Moat was inspired by the owner's journey down a Chinese river. And I love this image on the right. It's one of my favorite by her. And just this wonderful person, this woman, in this great coat and this great eye patch. And these are pictures that she took of her own house. This is her. And though she didn't really quite focus on buildings, she had a certain sensibility that I have always thought about having when I first saw her images and have held with me. And so as I went out to places like Old Mastic, originally started by William Floyd, who was a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a very unusual example in America of a house that really was owned by a politically involved person on a larger national stage, but was really a sort of agricultural holding. So a sort of rural power center. And today can be accessed by anyone freely. It's owned by the National Park Service, and the grounds are extremely well taken care of, and as is the house, although most people don't go for the house. This is the house prepared for winter, and it had such a great sense of things, just because the family at the mid 20th century was using it as a hunting lodge or a summer house. And one day just decided to donate to the National Park Service and left everything, including the soap and the kitchen sink. And here's the summer kitchen, and this door is this amazing patina. And that's, the view towards the two wings that project out north. And this is the plan. And the pink is kind of the original core that William Floyd had either bought or started. And then I'm going to go like this a little bit. So if anyone has questions, feel free to ask as we get to the center of the subject. But thinking about how you portray a subject, whether it's from photography or plan, or how you speak about a subject, the semantic choices you make. I was also very aware that it was interesting to me that these houses that seemed, because of her connection with metropolitan publications, were spread as a sort of idealized American house, even though they're quite Long Island, kind of substituting for a national sensibility. All these interesting personalities who were very creative were also running through them. You have Jupiter Hammond, who an incredible poet and writer who was enslaved his entire life. Walt Whitman, looking very jaunty, and who doesn't know him? There's a mall named after him. And then there's Anna Wintour, and she, is kind of keeping up the torch out in Mastic. And so I guess before going any further, I think, in architecture, you always talk about the place where you're building, the place where you live. And I think the first time I really saw a map and I changed how I was looking at maps was when I lived in the Pacific for a year. And there you were always oriented against the Pacific. So, it was no longer the Atlantic in the middle of the map. And I think it helps to look at Long Island if you turn the map 90 degrees and take in the fact that there's something quite similar to the Chesapeake that's connected up to the outer islands, up to Cape Cod. And it tells you that you're in a maritime place. And before the introduction of European building techniques and decorative traditions, of course, there was a whole group of people, different Algonquin bands that had been here for quite some time with their own, political machinations between themselves and traditions on the island and seasonal traditions. And though my conversation really isn't geared towards that, these people are still here to different degrees, as are elements of the language that certainly have enriched the present day looking backwards. And that's a romantic view that kind of blots out the sort of difficulties and anxiety and trouble and damage that was done. But at the same time, it's sort of true historical lens. And the interesting thing is these houses are a way to access that history, despite how complicated it might be. And now kind of just moving straight to the European side of things in the 17th century, Long Island was unusual because there was the New Amsterdam, the Dutch influence, and then the Connecticut colony starts launching onto the East End. And so by 1650, there's a sort of very fluid, boundary. But, neither power, neither Dutch nor the English could really influence things because they just didn't have enough people to kind of marshal anyone in one way or the other. So people were pretty much left to their own devices. And there was no established church in the island. So there's definitely a sort of emerging proto-American sensibility, I think, much more so than, people talk about the Pilgrims as being the original. It seems like intellectual laziness, because to me, the island here, this sort of mercantile, cultural melange of different people and different groups is very, very heterogeneous. And so seems to me very proto-American. And to go back to Barbara Van Loo, the historian I mentioned, she spoke in a number of her writings about the middle band. And it was where the English and the Dutch building traditions started to merge on the island. And always bearing in mind that New York City had an outsized influence on the trajectory of the island. And also, you know, for the book itself, if anyone's read it, probably the thing I regret not pushing a little bit more was a little discussion on what I mean when I say manors. I use it in the legal land grant sense. There were a few manorial grants on Long Island, just as there were the Dutch patroonships up the Hudson. You know, so here, for an example, in the pink is the St. George patent that later on was extended to the darkest gray on the map. And that's the Manor of St. George today. The oldest portion of the house is to the far right. And, you know, looking out towards the water, the means of commerce and connection. And so again, this rambling floor plan, how do we make sense of this? Before we get to the sort of enveloping romanticism of the 20th century and all the decorative and, you know, the artifacts that we bring into a house. And here's a great example of the merger of not just different Dutch and English building techniques, but also the merger of Georgian federal architecture, colonial architecture, and techniques at builders who were trying to merge all these things over the generations. So this house is topped by a band of what some people call eyebrow windows. I prefer the term frieze when they're used this way because it's establishing a rhythm on an otherwise irregular facade. And that's kind of in telling you that somebody's aspiring to some sort of regularized, harmonized architecture. Because up until the 20th century, most of these houses did not involve architects, but rather talented builders and knowledgeable owners if they had some sort of architectural aspiration. And there are two main branches of these buildings. The first were homesteads that sort of evolved over time, depending on the fortunes of the families that had them or sold them and bought them. This is an example, the Powell farmhouse at Old Bethpage, which is a great example. Might have looked like this originally. Over time, it grew to an additional kitchen wing. And by the end, you get that classic rambling sensibility. And for these houses on this branch, there's very little external decoration, but the massing is always very sensitive, and that's where a great deal of the charm comes through. And to me, that's not sort of a light, frilly thing. Charm is a means and a reason for being, and so I think that was a value that these people executed with their hands over time. And on the other branch, you have high style houses. Now, that sort of Chippendale frosting across the top is a later addition, but this house began as a sort of grand central block. That grand central block is what you would be greeted by, although originally it would have been a more meandering path that would take you through a bit of parkland and then interspersed with agricultural fields in sort of the English tradition. Sorry?
What?
Oh, sorry, if you can mute yourselves.
Okay, sorry. This sort of avenue approach was a later approach, but this is an example of a house that began with a great deal of style and prominence and connected to a plantation economy. Originally, it would have been the main block and then subsidiary ancillary buildings like kitchens, houses for enslaved people, houses for servants, and the family would have been in the main block. And eventually it became more like a summer house for a farming family. And they had this beautiful federal intervention. And it's, I think, probably the finest federal room on Long Island, in my opinion, is this stair hall, because it just combines so many really charming things and so many really finely wrought architectural details. Because the symmetry of the Georgian block was now messed up by the intervention of this sort of gently rising stair that turns twice. But you don't really notice it because the paint envelops everything in this deep blue, and this glossy green is applied on top of it. So it all sort of glows. And so the millwork and the architectural sort of envelope right in front of the stairs sections it off as a separate room. And so there's a sequence of space now that hadn't originally existed there. And there's beautiful paneling throughout the house. It's fairly unusual on Long Island to see this. I think Sylvester Manors, the other great example, to see them in a bedroom like here. Also great insulation too. And this is Joseph Lloyd Manor, which just shows a sort of repeated remodeling. You know, the front, what is that? What is that? So the interior was probably the most sophisticated thing when it was first built, as a sort of new residence for a family that had been in a sort of glorified house down the road that wasn't nearly as grand. So they did a great job with the interior, and then over time, bought by people from New York City as a sort of country retreat, it underwent this whole Victorian reinvention. And so you see these kind of romantic dormers, and you think of Gothic novels, and just, I think they're really beautiful. And they were also on the front originally. And then eventually you get to the 20th century when people want things, you know, a bit spick and span, this colonial revival. It's a mix of federal elements, simple columns, and there's a great deal of charm. And what I love about it is that you can see all of that as you walk around this house. And so that kind of brings us to the 20th century. So up until now, we're talking about people, whether they are sophisticated and urbane or more provincial, but everyone was aspiring and they wanted something special in the place that they were living. By the 20th century, there were now the specialists, the architects, kind of descending on these places where previously they hadn't really been involved, except maybe through pattern book influence. And I think, again, it's notable that I think Long Island had an outsized influence on American building, not just because its houses and farmhouses were portrayed as like an American ideal, but also because architects who had a great deal of influence throughout the country chose to buy Long Island farmhouses and to reinvent themselves in the reinventing of these houses. So Stanford White, William Lawrence Bottomley, and Archibald Brown, and Henry Bacon. I mean, it's pretty much everyone who was great at one time. Here is Stanford White's Box Hill, the interior shot by Tony Frizzell again. I mean, I think it's just this amazing, you have these incredible Baroque columns in front of this sort of very Japanese sensibility, more so because everything's being enveloped in shadow, and sort of all his little kind of finds across the way. That's Tony's house that he worked on as well. He married into a local family that unusually had come into money on its own. And so he was able to do up his own house on the left, Box Hill, while experimenting for, I think there were 3 sisters. And so certainly the influence working on his own house right there, you can see it's, you know, when he's working in Newport in the Isaac Bell house, he's translating that in a more upscale way. So, you know, designers often will do a great deal of trickery that brings just as much great effect and ambiance to a space, but for their client, they might do it in a more refined or costly way. So here, you know, he's using dark wood to achieve that, those enveloping shadows. William Lawrence Bottomley, the great architect known for Richmond, he bought a Long Island farmhouse, Hickory Hill. I think he was mayor of Brookville at one point. And here's an example of that, his restoration of this property being propagated and disseminated through publications in the 20th century. This is House and Garden. So it's both about the interior and the furniture inside of it, about the gardens and the grounds, about a sense of how you might live in it, but also a connection to history. And also, I think, pretty upfront that he's reinventing it a bit in the image that he finds most pleasing. And I prefer that attitude because I think that's taking ownership of a building, and I think that's part of stewardship. And this is in, you know, the most recent owner, I think the Oyster Bay Pilot, in an article about her efforts to restore the house today. And then there's Archibald Brown of Peabody, Wilson and Brown, who, as a firm, I think is probably one of the more interesting of the 20th century, that also very unheralded. One of the partners died prematurely, I think on an ocean liner. But to show the kind of diversity, so here's the Shallows, this kind of modernist confection. And then there's the Land of Clover, sort of neo-Georgian. Here's the Schmidlet house, also called Rumpus House, that they worked on. An example of a Long Island farmhouse that they did something really clever with. They extended the house with these long wings that are so subsidiary, they don't even really notice it. It's really just the 3-bay wide main block. and this little wing on the left. And the front porch is even extremely inventive because it's so simple. It's almost assuredly 20th century because it's basically just posts and brackets that are put together, painted over. I mean, it's so simple, but the rhythm it introduced to the house, it's currently actually being renovated. The Land Alliance, the North Shore Land Alliance bought the property for the land, and then a private owner was found to rehabilitate the house. But anyway, I think just the rhythm they established, it's just a great deal of charm. And this is the other side. It's like a Janus, I mean, the front is one thing, the back is this sort of really maximal 20th century grandeur, and yet sort of very like low key domestic scale at the same time. Peabody Wilson Brown also worked on the homestead, which is in the book, which is just an incredible little house. And it's the assemblage of the various ancillary buildings and the roof line, which kind of make it almost seem like a little village perched on the water. And again, it's about the massing. It's not about a lot of architectural ornamentation. It's clever massing. It's the size of the windows in proportion to the walls. It's about the fact, these beautiful shingles. And this is Archibald Brown's own house, East Farm. A bit of controversy surrounding it in terms of how it was sold. It was originally in one place. A later owner moved it. But fascinating to look at in plan and to see this old photograph that the dining room had this sort of very Mediterranean revival feel to it, while whereas the front was sort of pretty much kept in terms of a colonial scale until you get to this inserted stair hall, which is pretty grand, wrapping up around and bringing you upstairs. And then you have Henry Bacon, known for his work in Washington, who had a great deal to do with Sylvester Manor's 20th century appearance. In a way, probably the least reliant on Long Island precedent, unlike Peabody and Wilson and Brown, whose work can sometimes be difficult to tell whether it was them or was it there before, unless you have, if you're doing testing of the wood or you have old archival photographs to look at. But this is about the more like wider colonial revival movement, but a great deal of charm. And when you get inside the house, you can start to see, all the various pieces coming together. You have this very grand Victorian stair hall. You have the Georgian paneling and real panels. That was a luxurious thing when it was built, and even more luxurious today. Beautiful wallpapers. There's Zubair in one room, and just a great deal of charm. And so it's having acknowledged all of the architects of the 20th century that were kind of refining the idea of a Long Island farmhouse down to certain elements, whether it was a chamfered post and the Dutch door from the Dutch, or certain techniques of arranging things in more English traditions. There were, in addition to the architects and the literary people and the photographers influencing how people perceive these buildings, connoisseurs. And so, Howard Sherwood was a man who bought a Long Island farmhouse, and he founded the, SPLIA, which is now Preservation Long Island. And he was just motivated by his love of the texture of the building, but unafraid also to just introduce new elements. So the West Parlor paneling was from a local house that he reinstalled with his architect, having been unsatisfied with what was there previously. And so I guess at the end, it's really, this is a Long Island farmhouse is a sensibility. It's a sense of atmosphere, anchored to this island with a particular connection with New York City and that urban environment. And now I guess, these are just some houses that I particularly appreciated visiting. Thatch Meadow, run by a great steward, Conkey, and across the way is the homestead, that house was worked on by Peabody, Wilson, and Brown, showing the neighborhood connection too. His house was nearby as well. That's Conkey, and she inherited different sections of land at different times, and now she's working on the main house. The sun porch has these fabulous windows that just lower themselves all the way into the ground, and if you see right above that, there's this little kind of windowed gallery. I'll get to that in a second. And she's interesting because she inherited the house from her grandmother, who they had a small family bank, and her brother, went to war, and she really turned it around. And she turned out that she was actually very good at investing. And eventually she had bought land that would become Levittown, and she kept, refusing to sell, refusing to sell, refusing to sell, until finally she was really made an offer that even she couldn't walk away from. And so she used that to buy Thatch Meadow. And so that's the sun porch. They're starting to work on it. And then I love this sort of windowed gallery, and it actually leads to her studio, which is the old kitchen. This is Hay Fever, which Jeffrey Bill Huber rehabilitated in a really masterful way. I think he did a nice job of inserting some new elements, like a new stair hall, newly arranged, but an unusual U-shaped configuration. And he just did a great job. And he introduced a lot of color, and I think a lot of atmosphere. This is Sagticos Manor, which went through a huge building campaign multiple times. The original section is what we're kind of looking straight at, that door with the two benches on either side. To the right of that is actually a giant white cube room. And then in the rear is a sort of 1890s addition by, I believe it's Henry Green. The addition is larger than the original house, despite all its many reconfigured expansions. And then you get to a place like the sort of melding between Sagticos. So you see on the left, when I took the image, it was Robert Lionel Gardner who created the house that you see in terms of the configuration of all the furniture and the decorative elements. And he was, he considered himself the last lord of Gardner's Island. I guess it depends who you ask in the family, but despite that, he did leave a really wonderful resource for people who are interested in great rambling rooms and spaces. And this is the great white cube room, which is a huge surprise to anyone wandering through the house, because you just enter different corridors and nothing is really resolved, but it's not the worse for it. This is the Albertson Meyer house, owned by Bill and Marianne, who run the printery in Oyster Bay. And a great example of, a half hall house. So the hall's on this side, it expanded, the original house is on the right. The door we're looking at right now is towards the older part of the house, the original kitchen. And there we are. And I always think that green light that comes in when you're really close to the woods or to shrubbery or the plants, I think to me, that's so summer. And this is Point Place, a great steward, Bob Arnold, who has one of those voices that's just so reassuring. He could tell you the worst news and he's just so charming and the best attitude. And he always, he just said, I love taking care of it. And I think it's for the future. And I'm going to be here for a while, but not forever. And whoever comes next will hopefully also enjoy it. He kind of excavated the basement, he did, and he created this wonderful space, very moody, very nice in the summer, I imagine. And a final house, the Carhart house, was totally 20th century on land that used to be part of the village of Laddingtown before it was demolished during the Gold Coast period. But I wanted to include it in the book because I thought the interiors were masterful, but I also think that at a certain point, a style can be translated beyond a building that requires a sort of original, authentic core. And so I think at this point, this house has been through several revolutions. And I think the last with Frank DeBiase as the interior designer, just a really nice and sensitive approach to a house for living in every day. And so then, that's the 21st century, and back to the cover, which was not what I was looking for originally, but I'm very happy to have met all those people. So I don't know if anyone has any questions, or I'm sure I omitted quite a bit, but I was just trying to give a sense of the subject and its expansiveness.
I'm trying to unmute everyone so that people can ask questions. See if I can do that. Or you can raise your hand. I'm having trouble unmuting, so. That was fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. And thank you for inviting me, Jocelyn.
Does anyone, the unmute function is not working well. So does anyone want to raise it? I'm scrolling through to see if anyone's raising their hand. there was so much information there. When you, I have a question, Kyle. When you mentioned Green as one of the architects, is that the same Green that's from California? Green and Green?
No,
Oh,
that
okay.
he was not an architect I focused quite a bit on. I sort of pulled that out of a distant memory, but who was really active on the South Shore. If anyone's interested, you can always email me and I'll send you the literature I have scanned on him. I don't think he was the one working in California though.
Okay. Well, it seems like a very quiet group of people. Going to give them one more chance to. And what was fun about this was that we saw so many images that aren't in the book. So it was kind of like behind the scenes. So thank you for that. I guess we'll wrap it up. Everyone, I'm just going to take one more look. You're unusually quiet tonight. And Kyle, thank you so much. Good luck with the book.
Thank you, and thank you, everybody. Have a good night and enjoy your weekend.
Good night,
Thank you, Kyle.
everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kyle.
It was great. Bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.